Hello, or I should say good evening, everybody. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future. And today my guest is Tony Cowden. Hello, sir.
Hello. Good to be with you. Thank you.
Tony Cowden is a retired US Navy officer who served in the Navy on the service combatants. Yes, that's correct. Correct me if I'm wrong, sir. And one of the ships he served on is was USS Clark, which should be known to the Polish audience. So where he was an executive officer, right? So second in command on the USS Clark, back in the 90s of the 20th century. So it's nice to host you, sir. So let's just get straight to the most quintessential question that everybody's asking these days. The Navy officer, even a retired Navy officer. So what is the regime? What is going on in the maritime warfare in the littoral waters of Eurasia in terms of the Black Sea, in the war between Russia and Ukraine, where apparently Ukrainians are, damaging or sinking even big deck ships of the Black Sea fleet. So what's going on? Where are we in this competition between the coast or the shore, the fort, and the fleet that is trying to blockade the coast or impose its will or enable the amphibious assault on the shore? Where are we in this balance sort of power?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. And it's a very interesting time, as the Chinese might say. But I would invite your listeners to go back and read Julian Corbett's thoughts on the contest between a superior and an inferior fleet. And in the Black Sea, for example, the Russians clearly have the superior fleet. In fact, the Ukrainians have, at this point, no fleet. Corbett talks a lot about them. What happens in naval warfare is that the inferior fleet chooses not to come out and fight the superior fleet because it would be destroyed. And so the goal of the superior fleet in general is to find ways to get the inferior fleet to come out and fight. In this case, of course, the Ukrainians no longer have a fleet, so the Russians aren't challenged in trying to get them to come out and fight. What the Russians are doing, for some reason, is continuing to quote unquote fight a fort. And I think many of your readers would be familiar with the quote often attributed to Admiral Nelson: "A ship's a fool to fight a fort," because it's a very dangerous thing. Yeah. And in fact, I'm writing an article this weekend about this topic. So the Russians have lost a number of ships, some patrol boats, an LST in port, and of course the Moskva, and now apparently the Makarov, to the Ukrainian actions. The last two apparently to anti-ship cruise missile attacks launched from shore. The shore being, in this case, quote unquote, the fort. It's a very challenging thing for fleets to fight a fort. What you typically want to do is take the fort away, and you do that often by seizing the fort. The Russian army has been unable to continue along the Black Sea coast of Ukraine and deny the coastline to the Ukrainians. And so the Ukrainians have been able to continue to employ shore-launched anti-ship cruise missiles against Russian ships. It really becomes an employment question of why the Russians are allowing ships to operate within a dangerous area without the scouting resources and the screening resources to protect the ships, and why, of course, at the very, very tactical level of anti-ship cruise missile versus a ship, why they're failing to defend against these cruise missiles. And at that point, I'll sort of stop and see if we're going in the right direction with this conversation.
Yes, exactly. That's of course the only the tip of the iceberg of this, the analysis. And there are many questions in the air, like the Moskva was sunk actually with allegedly only 2 cruise missiles, which has nothing to do with sort of the overwhelming salvo of 45 or 50, that also could be launched against a ship like that, for example, in the war between US and China in the littoral waters of the Western Pacific, including the ballistic missiles and other, missiles or, other munitions, standoff munitions from other platforms. So where are we in this competition between the David and the Goliath, in terms of does the missile warfare change this calculus? That it changes the way the fleet should operate. If we could go more granular, our audience knows Corbett, his famous maritime strategy, Mahan, another great naval strategist, also Gorshkov, and Castex from France. So also those continental navalists that want to protect the continent. So we can go very granular in trying to describe how would you, as a former Navy officer, how would you get against the fort if you were sort of this, Russian officer or something like that? Let's try to think about it, just or even you can make some hypothesis, to defend or something. Let's even speculate a little bit.
Well, I think Russia is making some strategic employment mistakes in utilizing their superior fleet. They own the Black Sea. They can do a distant blockade of the Ukrainian ports, the existing Ukrainian ports that they've not already seized, without endangering their ships. Why they're going into areas that they can be scouted and targeted is not clear. Especially in the most recent case, it appears that Makarov was within visual sight of Odessa. That's really not particularly smart.
Yeah.
So I don't know why they're not employing a distant blockade and staying out of harm's way. What they need to do, well, they need to do that for one thing, and then if they want to eliminate that threat and use bring their fleet in closer for whatever purposes, they're going to have to seize the shoreline and push back the anti-ship cruise missiles away from the Black Sea.
Okay, so one question is why have not just initiated the distant blockade. So what do you think? Why? Because they wanted really to have the amphibious assault, or the sort of show the presence and dominance, or maybe they were thinking about using caliber missiles against the land, but still they could do it from standoff positions.
Yes.
So what is your assessment in this particular case? So why?
Well, as you point out, if the Grigorovich class frigate has caliber missiles, but they have incredibly long range. They can launch those from anywhere in the Black Sea against Ukraine. So why they felt it necessary to bring it that close, I really have no idea what they're thinking. It just seems to be a serious employment mistake on their part, especially if the reports are true about the attack on the frigate.
Yeah,
I can sort of understand the attack on the Moskva. It was, I think, 60 miles off the coast, which is quite a ways. They may not have been aware of either the Ukrainians' targeting ability, or if the Ukrainians are getting intelligence from other sources, they may not have been sensitive enough to that. So there's some leeway there to say that, that wasn't really an employment mistake as much as it was a failure at the more tactical level of the ship to be prepared to defend itself against an attack. I just submitted an article, as a matter of fact, stepping through the defensive capabilities of, say, the Grigorovich class frigate, and really each incoming anti-ship cruise missile has to run a gauntlet of at least 4 defensive systems that each could have either destroyed or decoyed or deflected or whatever the missile. So why all of these systems are unable to do that when they are specifically designed to be able to do that suggests that the Russians aren't operating their ships very well.
I understand. So there is this sort of assumption that, especially this frigate was quite modern. It had the proper systems to defend against such a small scale attack from not a sophisticated kind of a missile, subsonic, right? Not a very sophisticated missile. But what could we say about the situation if the Ukrainians had like 35 missiles of this type and some other munition from UAVs or something else that they could employ against such frigate? Would you say the same about this defensive capability? At one point, they would have been overwhelmed, wouldn't they?
Yes. In planning for such an attack, you really do want to make sure that you are able to overwhelm the planned defenses of the ship. I wrote an article a couple of weeks ago looking at the Moskva attack and suggesting that on paper, from a planning perspective, the Ukrainians really didn't shoot enough missiles to be assured that they could overcome all the defenses of the Moskva and hit it with enough combat power to put it out of action. As it turned out, they were able to put it out of action with only 2 missiles and actually sink it, which suggests that, again, Moskva did not employ their defensive capabilities well enough. Yes, in general, you want to ensure that you're sending enough offensive combat power to overcome whatever the defenses are that you think the ship, the target, can employ.
Building on what you have just said, do you think that we are about to face a similar situation that we faced 100 years ago, roughly speaking, where the dreadnoughts, the big cruisers, and the big battleships became very quickly quite obsolete by the naval aviation, right? And that seemed to be a little small and very fragile compared to those behemoths of steel. But they completely changed the way you did the naval warfare in terms of range and also precision and also the punch. Yeah, that sent them almost to the records of history. I mean, those ships. So do you think that we are entering not the same but a similar paradigm change, that you need to be twice more careful being close to the shore because of the missiles that are small, that can be fired from the forest or some mobile launchers or even from the urban areas? So it's so difficult to preemptively knock them out, and they can really do harm, especially in terms of the cost and effect. And especially if you really fight against a formidable enemy, not like even Ukraine. So what does it say us? What do you think? What do you think in the US Naval War College in Newport? What would be the lessons learned from this?
Well, what you've identified as one of the really challenging aspects is trying to operate in a contested littoral environment. There have been entire books written on anti-access aerial denial strategies, which is a very old tactic. And anti-ship cruise missiles are just the latest, or shore-launched anti-ship cruise missiles are just the latest technology. Mines have been used in the past, shore artillery, things like that, air-based, or rather land-based aircraft, et cetera, are all examples of things that are designed to keep fleets away from your shore. Anti-ship cruise missiles are just the latest one, and they're still one of many. But they are a particularly challenging one. But you need to go back to the basics of fleet employment and screening, for example. Fleets do four things: they scout, they screen, they strike, and they base. And screening is really important. You want to make sure that the shore-based anti-ship cruise missile battery can't get a fire control solution on you. They can't detect you, or they detect a decoy, or they detect a less critical portion of your fleet. So there are ways to overcome the challenge, but it is a significant one.
Yeah, I have another question that I'd like to debate with you, or even banter a little bit. U.S. Navy is known for not liking being close to the littoral waters. You're a blue ocean Navy. Your combatants are designed to operate, in freedom of operation, maneuver far away from the coastal waters that are always, very, treacherous, for your ships. So, what is the mood among the U.S. Navy officers when they are forced by circumstance to operate in the narrow bodies of water, like like the Black Sea, or even worse, in the Baltic Sea, for example, or many littoral seas of the western of Asia? So what is this? What is this modus operandi? What is the way operate? What is the mood? What are the procedures? Do you like going there, or there is a ban to go against through the Danish Straits, for example, for big ships? Tell us more about it. What are the sayings? Maybe what are the proverbs or something among the U.S. Navy people?
Well, the fault of superior fleets is hubris, right? And we would like everyone to fight the way we want them to fight, because we're really good at that. And if you look at the British Navy in World War I in the North Sea, for example, it's very instructive, because they were continually frustrated because the German Navy wouldn't come out and fight them, toe to toe, which is what the Royal Navy really, really wanted, because that was their advantage. You will hear, I think you've heard a lot of senior U.S. Navy officers that love the idea of the Chinese Navy developing carrier strike groups, because they would like a Chinese carrier strike group to come out and challenge us one-on-one. And of course, because that's our strong suit. I'm hopeful that if faced with the Black Sea, the Baltic Sea, the South China Sea, etc., that wiser heads will prevail and will understand that there are real dangers in going into denied areas. They're denied areas for a good reason, and they're challenging areas. And you have to think more broadly than just fleet on fleet, and what your operational strengths are.
Oh yeah, and of course, as I talk, I'm based in Warsaw, in Poland. Rather, we are a country whose fate is being decided on land, in the land warfare,
sure,
not on the sea. And just with full disclosure, I may say that our debate will be watched carefully by many. But there is a major debate in Poland between the old school and the new school of thought as regards the procurement for the Polish Navy. So the old school wants to have, the full squadron of frigates being bought, purchased, of course, and deployed, with specifications really amounting to the destroyer of the U.S. Navy. That would sort of come up with the air defense capabilities that will also augment the land-based air defense capabilities. And still the Baltics, and then, of course, there's a new school that is saying about a threat from shore, a threat from aviation, a threat from mines and torpedoes, and many other things. And then those beautiful white elephants could be sunk quickly, just like the Russians ships are being in sequence sunk by when engaged by the Ukrainians. So given the fact that the Baltic is even a narrower body of water and a shallower body of water, and the shores are closer everywhere, much closer than in the Black Sea, and that the Russians, whatever we say about them, they are more sophisticated in terms of the missiles and the anti-access capabilities than the Ukrainians. What is your net assessment of what we should be discussing? What should be the strategy of the Polish Navy? How would you approach this problem?
Well, one reality of naval combat is that smaller, cheaper naval vessels, which necessarily have less defensive capabilities, also make for less appetizing targets for the enemy. They're also very valuable in screening more expensive, more capable vessels. My first ship, which I'll bring up here, was a very old guided missile destroyer, and I had a relatively long career, so I was commissioned well before the end of the Cold War. And we knew on an old guided missile destroyer that our role was to be out in front of the carrier. And if the Russian hordes came at us, our role was to shoot down as many enemy bombers and anti-ship cruise missiles as possible and absorb as many as possible in order to protect the aircraft carrier or whatever it was we were escorting and guarding. But I think you can do a similar thing with manned and unmanned screening vessels. On a guided missile destroyer protecting a carrier, we're talking about a much larger order of magnitude of the problem. But if you're trying to, for example, move a squadron of corvettes or frigates past Kaliningrad, for example, you might be able to effectively screen them with unmanned air and surface vessels and let them get by. There are ways, but it's a challenge. And I do understand, you have a limited budget, you have a limited number of large baskets you can buy, and it would be horrible if they were destroyed very easily.
Yeah. I understand that you don't want to speculate in depth about it, as this is being a sensitive thing. But there are many issues that first we need to think strategy. So, what objective you want to achieve? So, if you want to deny the sea, you don't need to have big ships, right? It's enough to employ capabilities from shore and from the air against the shipping of the enemy. So it's good enough. You agree with that? Yeah? If you simply want to augment the NATO capabilities of traversing the Baltic Sea, I wonder what sort of help you would bring, because the NATO is, as the name suggests, a North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is basically a Navy-based organization in terms of the United States being a naval power, predominant naval power in the world. So this connectivity across the North Atlantic is the heart of it. So there are better guys with better equipment to really do it. So what sort of assistance you are bringing to the table? I mean, irrelevant, to the NATO sort of composition of fleets, and also I don't believe in convoying anything across the Baltic in a hot war. So I mean, the tankers or anything. And for sure, the Polish squadron of frigates would not be capable anyway to convoy anything. So in terms of strategic, I personally, it's a full disclosure, I tend to believe that the new school is better suited for the Polish future, and we could spend this money on aviation, UAVs, and robotic capabilities, or some sort of the mosquito tactics, employing low signature, low hull, even unmanned or some manned, quite small combatants that don't need to have longevity and this what you seaworthiness, in English. And there should be many of them, right? Many of them to complicate the Russian planning and prevent amphibious landing or some sort of a blockade, or at least harass them. So that's it. Would you try to comment on that, or maybe?
Right. Well, it's often good to use a tactical situation or an operational requirement to focus your thought. There's been a lot of discussion, for example, in NATO, if Russia, for example, threatens the 3 Baltic states, how do we get forces there to help those states? And a lot of the focus has been on the land bridge through the Suwalki Gap.
Yeah.
I had the opportunity to travel through the Suwalki Gap in 2018. Very nice 4-lane highway that passes through there to Lithuania from Poland. But there's only one 4-lane highway. And if there's a crisis going on, it's going to be easily interdicted and certainly swamped with refugees. There's also a single, if I remember correctly, train line or rail line that goes into Lithuania. But Poland and Lithuania use 2 different gauges of railroad line. So it's not particularly convenient to move a lot of forces that way either. My personal opinion was, it may be hard to move things by sea, but it's going to be much harder to move them by land. So if you need to get forces to the Baltic to support the Baltic states, rather, I think you have to consider moving them by sea. Well, that means going by Kaliningrad, which you pointed out is the modern equivalent of a fort. The Russians clearly have very strong military forces and certainly can launch anti-cruise missiles against seaborne forces from Kaliningrad. So how do you move forces, whether they're Polish ships or NATO ships or whatever, necessary to reach the Baltic states? You have to go by Kaliningrad. And I think you have to go back to the basics. The number one way to defeat a fort that's protecting a coastline or a port or whatever is to either seize the fort or destroy the fort. Seizing the fort usually involves land forces. Well, it could take a while to seize the forts, and you have to move things quickly. So that maybe that's not readily possible, and it has its own challenges, right? The other way is to destroy the fort. Well, if the fort is a mobile launcher of anti-ship cruise missiles, that's very hard to destroy because you can move them around, you can camouflage them, you can hide them, and there can be a number of them. And they could be anywhere along the coastline or even some distance back from the coastline and still be able to threaten ships moving in the Baltic. So naval forces alone are not going to be able to counter that threat. You'd have to blanket the peninsula with air strike forces as well as electronic surveillance, et cetera, to detect any threat and to try and neutralize it as you try and move forces. Then you want to look again at the basics of fleet employment. And I talked earlier about screening. You're going to want to try and hide the major elements that you're trying to move through the area, and you're going to want to screen them with decoy forces and screening forces that can help defend against any attack coming from the land and maybe absorb that attack, just like I had to think about back in the late 1980s. So that's sort of the basics of how to address the problem.
Yeah, but by the way, you served in the 80s in the Atlantic fleets just or in the Pacific? Where did you serve?
Atlantic, Mediterranean, and off the coast of Norway. I never made it to the Baltic, unfortunately, or the Black Sea.
Why didn't you make it to the Baltic?
Oh, well, my ship didn't get to go there. I really wanted to go there, but I wasn't driving the ship back then.
So it was not in the plans, yeah?
It was not in the plans, no.
Yeah, I asked this specifically because I wanted. So you were exercising. You were getting ready for that was called outer sea battle or something. This concept of fighting off the Russians, keeping them at bay, far away from the aircraft carriers. It was called an outer sea battle or something like that.
Yeah, outer air battle. Yeah,
outer air battle.
Yeah.
So I understand. So that was already, in the thinking, how to prevent, how to deny space so that the Russians could not employ their cruise missiles actually and their bombers against the main combatants. Yeah. Already in the 80s, and the technology has changed, right, over the last 40 years. It's getting more and more difficult, right?
Yes, the flight profile of modern anti-ship cruise missiles, like the Neptune, is quite challenging. Neptune flies very, very close to the surface. Is very hard to detect at any range. The threat that we were facing was large physically and in effect, but easier to defend against. But the Russians have always believed in numbers, so it was really a question of can you defend against all of the things that they can bring against you.
So saying about the numbers, let's focus now on the Western Pacific. Let's move away from the Russian threat. Let's talk about the Chinese threat. I'm sure you're thinking about it, because this goes big in terms of the numbers of the missiles and the salvo competition that could be employed against the surface combatants. There's a problem, of course, of the supplementing the inventory. You need to go to the port and stuff. So how would you fight the Chinese shore? Or we shouldn't, or the US Navy shouldn't. You should abandon the air sea battle concept and focus only on the defense-minded, offshore balancing or some archipelago defense, you name it, right? In the distant blockade. So what would you?
Right.
Okay, you are a supporter of which concept to fight China, so to speak, and employing the Navy?
Well, I'm not a big fan of going into the South China Sea quickly. I would mention that historically, the anti-ship cruise missile was developed as an asymmetric response to the superiority of things like carrier strike groups, and that's why
Kamikaze was sort of the first, manned but still cruise missile, wasn't it?
The Kamikaze, yes. The Kamikaze was really the first anti-ship cruise missile, if you will. And there's a lot to be learned from looking at the Kamikaze operations, unfortunately. But that's why the Russians adopted the anti-ship cruise missile so much more than the US Navy did, is because they saw it as an effective way to counter the aircraft carriers, which they could not, match a carrier strike group at sea directly without them. So, and a lot of navies, including the Chinese Navy, have adopted, small, fast, cheap missile patrol boats that pack a lot of anti-ship cruise missiles and can deliver a lot of offensive combat power. They're not particularly good at defensive combat power, but you can get a lot of anti-ship cruise missiles on a small, fast patrol boat, which is a real problem. If you have enough of them, you mass them and you coordinate their attack, that can be a real problem for a group of surface ships. The Chinese have invested a lot of technology and systems on trying to deny the ability of the U.S. Navy to operate freely in the South China Sea. anywhere within let's say the first island chain. And that's a real challenge for the U.S. Navy. If the U.S. Navy was tasked tomorrow to prevent the Chinese from putting forces ashore in Taiwan, the worst thing they could probably do is send a carrier strike group straight into the South China Sea and try and have surface forces go in and affect that. There are things that the U.S. Navy could do, though, with screening and other strike forces without putting them at significant danger. And that's what I would recommend.
So you would keep them at at distance around Guam and elsewhere, so that first of all you deal with the Chinese threat by submarines and aviation or with other ways.
Right.
Weaken them, soften them up, right, a little bit, and then just come big. Yeah. So, and you're talking the South China Sea, which is quite a massive body of water and also deep water. Yeah, and it's much bigger, looking at the map than the Black Sea, or not to mention the
Right.
Baltic Sea. And still, you are, afraid to sail into those waters at the beginning of the conflict.
Well, yes. I prefer to talk about prudence than fear, though.
I understand. Fair enough.
The Chinese have the opposite problem. They are absolutely hemmed in. The U.S. Navy will shut down China's ability to move anything, any oil, any gas, any goods in or out of China or in or out of the first island chain within 24 hours. China is going to be totally maritimely, if you will, isolated from the world immediately. However the contest plays out between the military forces, China is going to be cut off from the world by sea immediately, and that's a huge strategic problem for China. Their economy cannot stand to be cut off for any length of time. They're not going to be able to feed their people for very quickly. It would be a strategic disaster for them to go to war with the U.S.
Unless, of course, they have the continental lines of communication with resources, not the maritime lines. Yeah.
Well, one of the advantages of the maritime is buoyancy. Ships can carry much more goods than, say, rail lines or trucks.
Yeah.
I actually really became aware of this in studying Mexico at the Naval War College, which seemed like a strange country to pick on as a student, or be assigned. But you can have a single ship carry 10,000 containers from China to the west coast of the U.S. in a week. Okay. To move 10,000 containers across the Mexico border takes 10,000 people driving 10,000 trucks. And it's just not as economically feasible to do that as it is to move that amount of goods by sea. Same thing with combat power. The combat power of a warship is gigantic compared to the equivalent combat power of, say, an army, a single warship. So there's a real advantage to an economy of scale to moving things by sea. The Belt and Road Initiative has roads and has rail, but we'll never be able to compete economically with moving the amount of goods that you can move by sea. The sea is critical.
Yeah, I agree. But still, coming back to the discussion about the mass, concentration of mass, and the precision, don't you think that already introduction of the torpedoes and patrol boats and mines asymmetrically changed this old Nelson style thinking that it's always, the ship, the main ships that are decisive factors in the warfare, especially in the littoral waters. And today, the environment is becoming much more complicated with, air, mines, rockets, electromagnetic also nuisance from the shore, which is of not trivial importance, right? So, is it simply so that the big tech navy simply has to move away from the shore and fight in the open ocean more than it used to in the past? Or and with the lasers and other, with all this technology that is changing this, and precision weapon technology. So what will be the evolution of the naval warfare in, let's say, within the next 50 years? What is your guess?
Wow. Well, the generic answer is the evolution of naval warfare will evolve. And predicting evolution is really hard. But I think that the general answer is a solution will be found. But huge changes occur, right? I mean, the dinosaurs became extinct for a reason. Battleships are no longer our capital ships for a reason. Evolution occurred, and there may be evolution that has large manned ships like aircraft carriers and destroyers and frigates become either obsolete, or you have to operate them in radically different ways. I think we have a ways to go, though. And if you look at, say, the history of the torpedo, invented the modern torpedo in the 1880s. Yeah. You had a whole evolution of things to associated with the torpedo, and then countering the torpedo, right? Destroyers were originally torpedo boat destroyers because you needed something to protect the cruisers, which were the scouts for the battleships, from the torpedo boats, which could go out and cheaply sink a cruiser. And if the cruisers are sunk, the battleships won't have their eyes to find the other battleships, the enemy battleships that they're trying to find. And then, of course, if their screen is gone, they themselves are subject to attack by torpedo boats. So you develop these torpedo boat destroyers to counter the torpedo boats. And so when those were countered, then you develop submarines that could launch torpedoes, and you employed those. And then you had to develop the anti-submarine warfare capabilities to try and detect and sink the submarines, and on and on and on. So there will be evolution. I'm not exactly sure how it's going to turn out. The Russians are learning the very painful lesson that you need to go back to the basics and not fight forts without adequate screening and employment considerations. So I don't know if that answered your question, but
sort of it touches on it. I understand your diplomacy, and maybe let me add this ask this question in a more straightforward way. So, are you in this camp in the United States that you should reduce the numbers of the aircraft carriers in the Pacific, and create a more versatile fleet with the dispersed lethality? That's what you call, or you should still be a carrier force, so to speak, and auxiliary elements helping the carrier force.
Well, the U.S. Navy's role is to fight the fight over there. We need to be an expeditionary navy that can carry the fight overseas. That's a different challenge than most navies have. And most navies don't have the worldwide national interest and commitments that the U.S. Navy is tasked with. Most navies are protecting their own coastline or their local sea lanes, or they're in support of the U.S. Navy, like in NATO or whatever, in doing that on a global or wider scale. So the U.S. Navy is always going to be concerned about being able to take the fight far overseas, and that often involves projecting power ashore. And if you want to project power ashore, you need the ability to deliver combat power at great range, and at a great recycle rate and with great accuracy. Aircraft carriers are particularly good at that, but as you point out, they require a significant amount of protection. And of course, countries that might be subject to power projection from the U.S. Navy are trying to find asymmetric ways to keep carriers away from their shores. And that's the challenge. I don't see a radical change in the U.S. Navy structure in the near future for decades. I think we're going to be committed to the aircraft carrier for a long, long time. And it may be that the forcing function for a major change is defeat, or a clear demonstration that, carriers don't work anymore. I mean, this is what happened with battleships, right? It was clear.
Thinking of Prince of Wales and, the Japanese and stuff. Yeah, okay.
Exactly. And the U.S. Navy was sort of forced into the decision very quickly because most of their battleships were sunk in Pearl Harbor. But as you point out, the British lost theirs to air power because they operated them without adequate air protection, and they learned painfully that you can't do that. So battleships immediately became integrated, or soon became integrated, with carrier strike groups, and became one of two things until we had gained air superiority of an area. They became air defense for the aircraft carriers, and then later they became shore bombardment in support of sending forces ashore on the various islands in the Pacific, for example. But there was a painful transition there, more painful for the Royal Navy, I guess, in learning those lessons and in changing that modus operandi.
Yeah, that is true.
And unfortunately, combat is the most effective teacher of lessons, and you often don't see these lessons coming until you experience them. I'm a big fan of the book Neptune's Inferno, the story of the Battle of Guadalcanal, the naval battle of Guadalcanal. The Marines will complain to this day that we abandoned them on the shores of Guadalcanal. But the fact of the matter is that 3 times as many sailors as ground troops died in the U.S. forces in the Battle of Guadalcanal. And that was because the U.S. Navy thought it knew how to fight. It had advanced technologies like radar, fire control available to them, but they didn't know how to employ them. And they had to learn some very, very painful lessons on how to fight at sea. And they learned that the Japanese had developed weapons and tactics like their long length torpedo and night fighting tactics that were far superior to what the Navy was prepared to do, our U.S. Navy.
Yeah, I remember this exactly. This fight on the shores of the Guadalcanal. That and it was still early in the war, so the fate of war was not decided yet at that time. And there were many in the Japanese Navy that thought that the war was won, for Japan. Yeah.
A friend of mine, a retired Navy admiral, pointed out to me that in his meeting with his counterparts in the Army and the Air Force, but especially the Army and the Marine Corps, is that because of Afghanistan and Iraq, the ground forces, U.S. ground forces, had done a lot of painful lesson learning. They weren't prepared to fight insurgency type and guerrilla type actions. They had to learn how to do it the U.S. Navy, hasn't fought anybody since World War II, really. Not really in fleet-to-fleet engagements.
Yeah.
And we have a real challenge, I think, to understand how things have evolved and how we might perform, fleet on fleet, or against asymmetric foe, that an inferior fleet that has learned how to fight effectively asymmetrically.
Yeah, it's nothing, rare in the history of naval warfare, because, as I understand, the naval battle is so decisive and forced attrition that everybody's just avoiding it. And once you are dominant at sea, nobody wants to confront you. So the Royal Navy had the same thing, between the Trafalgar and the escape flow and the Jutland battle. Actually, with a few exceptions, during the Crimean War, but it was of no match. There was no battle, naval battle for 100 years. So
Yes,
maybe.
I'm sure you've read Andrew Gordon's The Rules of the Game. Was for a while there very popular in the U.S. Navy. I hope everyone's still reading it because it describes what the U.S. Navy is facing. As you point out, from Trafalgar to Jutland, for 100 years, that no one challenged the Royal Navy, and they hadn't had to fight fleet on fleet, and they didn't perform as well as expected when Jutland came around, and the navies and the technologies had transformed immensely, immensely in that 100 years.
Yeah.
Well, it's been 70 some years, 80 years since, almost 80 years since the end of World War II, and the technologies have changed, tactics have changed, the threat has changed, and we would be well worn to think about that some more.
Everything is changing, and exactly at Strategy and Future, we think about what change is bringing as we try to forecast the future. And I don't want to, be too grim, but I think that the United States Navy is going to face a war in the Western Pacific before this 100 years will have passed between, let's say, Iwo Jima and this new engagement. Or at least there is a high probability that this would happen. So I hope that you guys there are getting ready for it. We are watching it closely from Eurasia, as the fate of Eurasia is hanging upon you having access to us and controlling the sea lines of communication and so on. So
one thing I'd like to caution is going back now to the Black Sea and Russia's performance is overlearning lessons from their tactical failures. Both the Moskva and especially the Makarov should have been able to defeat one or two anti-ship cruise missiles fired at them. The systems they had were designed to defeat those, and if they were fully operational and manned by competent operators, there's every likelihood they should have been able to defeat a two-missile attack on those ships. So I really caution taking too many lessons that say that all surface ships are now obsolete because of what we've seen with the Russians. I think we have to factor in the Russians are not employing their fleet well, and they're not operating their fleet well. I think that's very clear.
That might be so. They have never been a good naval sea people, so to speak. They were always a continental power, having land army, and they were usually poor at the navy operations. And that's another argument, for our navy. So against whom, actually? And especially if Finland and Sweden were to join NATO, the Baltic Sea would become an inland lake of the NATO. So again, in my modest opinion, the investment in the surface combatant would be even less needed for Poland in that case.
Right. Well, in the starting point, it was interesting. I had a chance to visit Poland, Lithuania, and Belarus in the spring of 2018, and talked to a number of senior defense and security officials in all three countries. And I was surprised by the lack of focus on the Baltic Sea. Even in Lithuania, what we consider to be a Baltic nation, there was no discussion by senior defense officials about what the Baltic Sea meant to them. From my perspective, I talked earlier about the challenge of NATO helping out the Baltic nations. The Baltic Sea is critical to the security of Lithuania, for example. And so I would ask, because I didn't get an answer from anyone I talked to in Poland at the time, what does Poland think about the strategic importance of the Baltic? What do you want to be using it for in times of crisis? I gave an earlier example of, supporting the Baltic nations given some Russian transgression over there, but that's sort of that's their strategic issue. So I think the starting point would be, for me, if I were thinking about Poland's problem, is what do we want to be able to use the Baltic for? What does it mean to us strategically? And then what kind of forces do we need, naval, air, et cetera, to ensure that?
Yeah. So this is a lesson that we need to learn in Poland and think about it properly.
Right. I gave the example of the US Navy. Our role is to take the fight over there. We're not designed to protect New Jersey and California. We're designed to project forces into the Mediterranean, the Baltic, the North Sea, the Norwegian Sea, the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea, wherever our nation says it has interest. That's where we're designed to go. And like I said, that's different than most navies. So I would focus on, what does the Baltic mean to us strategically, and how do we want to use it? And then what capabilities do we need to ensure that?
Yeah. Thank you very much, sir. Our guest today was retired US Navy officer Tony Cowden. And you stay with us for more episodes at Strategy and Future. Thank you very much, Tony.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was fun.